This is Duke University.
Before I start, I'll just give you a little bit of a prologue. I remember as a child playing around the Library of Congress and always being really taken by one particular statue, which said underneath it, "The past is prologue." And I remember asking, first of all, what does that mean? And then being told that if you don't understand the history, then you don't understand the context, and you really can't make sense of the present. And the book that I researched and published in 2010, from which this lecture is drawn from, is really that story. It's to try and understand the multiplicity of minority groups in the Middle East. And when I'm talking about the Middle East, I'm really talking more about the Levant, or the areas of the former Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. And so the study really grew from there. Now, let me make sure that I'm going to be, got it. So I'll start with this particular quote, because I think this will set the stage. This is a quote that I recorded 10 years ago. A lovely old man in Damascus who had been persuaded by his grandchildren to give me an interview about his experience and the experience of his parents in coming to Syria. And when I entered the house and we took off our shoes and got ready to sit down, I realized that this was not going to be a one-to-one interview. I had about 12 grandchildren and then his own children who were all retired military generals and so on in the bathroom, all present. And I thought, this person is not going to speak openly. But before I could sit down, he began. And he began with these words, which weren't taped, but my research assistant just started writing really quickly. So before I asked him a single thing, he began with, "We came in carts, big carts. We didn't stop. Eating and drinking were all done in the carts, all the way from Abkhazia to Sham, to Syria. What can I say? Death would have been much better. When a person dies, he's rested. But those grandfathers of ours suffered a lot, as no other people ever did. They came from Abkhazia in carts, as I told you, all the way to the Golan. In the Golan," and then I've cut a few things out here, "it has been continuous tragic mishap and suffering. But then just as we started to belong, to become rested, the Jews took over and we were driven out." He's referring to the June War of 1967. "And we left the Golan empty-handed with nothing but the clothes on our back." So what I wanted to do, and I had never really thought it would be so relevant today, is to look at forced migration in terms of the Middle East. My main thrust is to try and show you how forced migration has become the defining feature of the 21st century. And if you consider, which Miriam was referring to, that today the UNHCR, which is the main agency, but not the only agency of the UN for refugees, cites 11 million refugees, and the other agency, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees, cites 5 million more. You have a total of 16 million refugees recognized by the UN system. 45% of those are now from the Middle East. So we could say almost half of the world's refugees are coming from this region. But what I'd like to do now is to actually take you back to the mid to late 19th century, up to the present, and go through a catalog of displacement and dispossession of millions of Muslims, Christians, and Jews from the borderlands of the Russian and Ottoman Empire, from the Pale of Settlement, which was created by Catherine the Great at the end of the 18th century, into the Balkans, and then into Anatolia, and then into the southern provinces of the Levant. So what I'll try and show is the way in which forced migration really came into being as part of the policy of empire, the Tsarist Russian continual expansion across its borders, having been stopped from expanding west into Europe, really pushed south and continuously won one war after another against the Ottoman Empire. The way that migration was then carried forward by the colonial mandate authorities, which resulted in, again, much more displacement, and then reinforced with the creation of the new nation states. Almost all of this migration was southward. Only the skilled professionals and largely the Christian forced migrants were allowed to move west and granted resettlement in Europe and elsewhere. So this is not new. We're talking about, from the 19th century forward. But most of these forced migrants who moved into the Middle East, of course, initially were longing to return to their homes and villages, but very shortly thereafter began to create new places that they called home in very impermanent landscapes. And now, as we see the struggle taking place in the countries bordering on to Syria, we also see the struggle not to become Palestinized or emplaced or encamped with no return and no solution. Miriam mentioned a little bit earlier how many Syrians have fled across the border into the neighboring states, and I think we've all agreed it's between 3 to 4 million. But you also need to keep in mind that another 9 million have been displaced, and they are able to cross borders, but they're refusing to. And this is, again, part of the fear of Palestinization. Many Syrians feel if they cross the border, they may not be able to come back. And so they continue to reside sometimes in territories that are governed by the state and sometimes by various opposition groups. Many of them are receiving assistance from within the UN system and local NGOs. But it's an interesting fact that more are preferring to be displaced within than to cross a border and be given a new label as refugee. I don't think you really need this map, but just in case, there are some audiences I speak to who don't really understand what were the dimensions of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. So I just put it up here as a focal point. I'm going to focus on, as I said earlier, on the millions of Muslims, particularly, and somewhere near 50 to 60,000 Jews in the 19th century who were displaced. I want to look at the mechanisms whereby they were able to borrow from existing social, economic, and political institutions in order to create new communities that were often not based on territoriality or contiguous territory, but were rather based on social ties across rather vast regions. So what I'm going to do is focus on 4 groups, the Circassians and the general Caucasian population that basically, starting from the Crimea through this area, were forced either across the Black Sea into the European Ottoman Empire of the 19th century or into Anatolia and further south. And then I will also look at the Armenians forced out of eastern Turkey, as well as further on then the displacement of some Kurds and then also Palestinians. But each of these studies, as I said before, hopefully I'll be able to show how they were able to recreate new communities, even though they were deracinated or deterritorialized through the horizontal links that they were able to set up. Just a very brief word about methodologies. I said earlier, I set out to interview the oldest surviving members of these 4 communities, knowing that by choosing the oldest surviving members, there could be a problem of recall, of false memory. There are many different problems with interviewing with the collection of these kind of oral histories. But I was hoping that I would find articulate older members of these 4 communities who would be happy to speak about their past. And so we did. I had local research assistants in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, which are the 4 areas that I basically worked in. And I created a topic guide to try and help to stimulate the memory and the recall of the interviewees. I was very aware that if I didn't have the right questions and the right probing approach, that I might not have been able to get them to open up and talk in the way that they did. In fact, I shouldn't have worried. Those people who are interviewed, with one exception, I can talk about that later on, couldn't wait to tell their story. And in many cases, it was the first time that they actually shared their memory of forced migration and early efforts at integration in the new places that they called home. Some of the interviews were particularly poignant because the people who I was interviewing in some cases were very old, were terminally ill, and I knew there wasn't going to be a chance to go back after a few months and say, I need to ask you a few more things. But in essence, they were all very wise interviews, in essence quite warm, but also reassuring of the human spirit of resilience and recovery. So just a few points I want to go over about the later period of the Ottoman Empire, the period that is called the Tanzimat era, the era of reform, a time from around the 1830s up until the mid-1870s, when the Ottoman Empire certainly felt the Sultan felt himself and the Ottomans as part of the comity of European nations, and he was out to prove how modern he was. So he implemented a number of decrees related to sovereignty and citizenship, set out a constitution and a parliament way before these things were actually happening in Europe. But what he also did was to formalize the system of government which actually encouraged and tolerated variations among people, ethno-religious variations among people. I'll say a little bit more about the system later on, but these were called the millet system, which allowed the various ethno-religious groups, the non-Muslim ethno-religious groups, to be basically governed, certainly in terms of family law, in terms of inheritance, in terms of marriage, in terms of death, by the patriarchate, if they were the various Christian groups, whether Armenian or Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox, and of course the Jewish chief rabbi for the Jews of the region. What I want to also just get to again is the startling array of movement of communities that were once rooted in the frontier conflict zones of the empire. So this is the startling movement of the Tatars of the Crimea, or the Muslim population of the Crimea, the Circassians, the Abkhazi, the Chechenian, the Dagestani. These are all terms that we know, but I want to put in place how they got to where they got and how many moved, how many actually lost their lives during this period. And again, a period which certainly by the end of the 19th century was a period which was coined as the period of the unmixing of peoples of the Ottoman Empire. So where the Ottoman Empire had these wonderful mixtures of people across, so that, the Armenian community, you couldn't say was just in Eastern Anatolia, it was spread throughout Anatolia, throughout the Levant, have to be careful, in Jerusalem, in Cairo, and the same with all of the other communities. But this unmixing, which began with a lot of meddling from Russia, again, I'm really turning Russia into the bad guy here, but they were, the creation of the state of Greece began with a lot of Russian spies being sent into the area that we now know of as Greece in the 1820s in order to try and foment uprising. Didn't work straight away, and so then there was, I think there was a massacre on an island, and I won't go into a great deal of detail, but from 1820 until 1829, there was a great deal of support from Russia in order to get Greece to separate from the Ottoman Empire. And eventually that succeeded. But the Greeks still couldn't decide on who was going to rule them. And so it took another 3 years before, in 1832, the Europeans decided to put a Danish prince onto the Greek throne. But this was a satellite of Russia at the time, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, so very close together. After Greece, you had the creation of Bulgaria, of Serbia, of Montenegro, and then eventually Greece, by the end of the 18th century, was strong enough to take over Thessaly, Crete, Macedonia, and so on. With each of these moves, of course, the population that was not of that I'm not going to say majority, because very often, for example, in Serbia, the Serbs weren't a majority, but by the time they had excluded most of the Muslim population, they were. So there was massive flight during this period, all related to a war, but it was flight that was designed to unmix peoples who had been living really quite well together for 300 or 400 years. So let me just start by saying a few words about the Circassians or the Chechens, basically the Muslim refugees that were who were on the frontiers of the empire. The first really large move emerged at the end of the Crimean War of 1854-56, which was when Britain, with its Ottoman allies, were defeated, and about 400,000 Muslim Tatars were forced to flee the Crimea. Unusually, these Tatars were allowed to sell their possessions, and so they left and became sort of middle-class Tatars as they moved into the Balkan area, the area that was known as Rumeli, and into parts of Anatolia. This was followed very quickly after that by another Russian-Ottoman war of 1865, when 500,000 Circassians, Chechens, and Dagestani were expelled because Russia took over the Caucasus and defeated the main, actually, he was Sufi, the main Circassian Chechenian leader, Sheikh Murad. Then in the 1870s, the next Russian-Ottoman war, which was again lost by the Ottoman, Tatars were again on the move, and this time it was 1.8 million Tatars were forcibly evicted. And then a number of the Circassians and the Chechens who had settled in the Balkans were also expelled because Russia insisted that it did not want to have any of the Circassians that close to Russia. They had quite a fierce reputation as being fighters. And so between around 1860 and 1920, another 2.5 million Circassians, Abkhazi, and Albanians were forced to move into the Ottoman Empire. So if you add it all up, I know it's a longish period of time. It's about 60 years, but nearly 4 million Muslim refugees, largely Muslim, some Christian, a few Jews, were forced out of these borderland areas, something that's hardly ever talked about. And of these 4 million, because there were no UN agencies around, there were no charities around to provide assistance to people on the road, it's been estimated by Justin McCarthy that 1 out of every 4 died on the way. So of the 4 million, about 1 million died on the way. And amongst the Federation of Circassian Scholars, they often say, this is what I learned in Ankara in August, that the first modern genocide was actually the Circassian genocide, which the world doesn't talk about. So 1 million people is a lot, even though it took a while before the numbers started adding up. So just a map again to show you, this is the area where so many of the Muslim refugees came from the Crimea and then from the Caucasus. And initially, most of them just moved into the Balkans, hoping that they could just resettle in the Balkans, similar sort of very mixed populations. But after the 1880s, as Russia took over this region and moved into this region, the Tsarist Russia insisted they all had to move out. And so they then were pushed into Anatolia and southern Syria. And that's what the first quote is about, that second wave of movement out of the region that was called Rumeli. I wanted to just show you this map because although the Ottomans had a very progressive policy in terms of resettling refugees and immigrants, in fact, I don't speak Ottoman Turkish. I can't read Ottoman Turkish, but there is obviously a problem because the same word, the Refugee Code of 1859, which was what the Ottomans put into effect in order to deal with these massive movements of people, is translated by some scholars as Refugee Code, but by other scholars as the Immigrant Code. So it's very clear that the Ottomans really weren't making a distinction as to why you were entering into the Ottoman Empire. But if you were coming into the empire and you were ready to give your allegiance to the Sultan, then in general, you were pushed out into the countryside. You were given either 11 or 17 acres of land, some seeds, some animals, in order to help you create a new life as a farmer. But for some of the populations, the Ottomans began to use, particularly the Circassians and the Chechens, let me just go back one, to settle their border region. You can't really make it out here, but I've got little white dots here all along the border. This is the region which is often referred to as the Marmura. It's the area between agriculture and the desert. And the Ottomans had, for a long period of time, been trying to manage the Bedouin who controlled the areas between the cities. The Ottoman basically ruled from the city and the periphery, and the regions between cities were often very, very dangerous. And so, trying to get from Aleppo to Homs, or from, well, Baghdad's not on the map, Baghdad to Damascus, you had to go through a very large, vast, empty area, which the Bedouin controlled, not the Ottomans. And so they were constantly trying to work out deals, pay them bounties, and so on, to allow safe passage. But the Ottomans had the idea of, why don't we just settle these Circassians, Chechens along this area, which they did. And it was a particularly successful policy because, as I just briefly mentioned before, the Circassians and the Abkhazi were renowned for their warlike characteristics. I just thought I would include this one picture of the exiles going into Anatolia and further south. They were very important militias for the Ottomans in the Balkans, but by the time they were being asked to move again within 2 generations, they decided they didn't want to move any further. So once they reached these areas in Syria and in Jordan, basically when the Ottomans lost World War I, the Circassian, the Chechen, Dagestani Ottoman officers, basically they took their jackets off, they burned the jackets, and they went and approached Emir Abdullah, who was creating Transjordan, and said, we don't want to go anywhere anymore. We will fight for you to stay in this place where we are. And they became the royal guard of the Jordanians. They were the close security detail of the Emir, now King Abdullah, pretty much like the Secret Service here in the United States. And this picture I love, which was taken really just a year before the assassination of King Abdullah I. You see the Circassian Guard, even in their 19th century Circassian dress on this side. And then the other security element of Jordan, which it's still the case today, was the Bedouin Arab Legion. So the Circassians, certainly in Jordan, became much more, I could almost say romanticized, much more obvious. In Syria, they maintained their discrete communities, but didn't become part of any kind of political or military elite. So I think that's all I'll say about the Circassians. But let me say a little bit more about the Armenians and the other Christian refugees who were on the Russian-Ottoman borders. I mentioned a little bit earlier the millet system, this tight sort of ethno-religious community that was recognized by the state and had its own patriarchate. The Armenians, as the apostolic Armenians, had always played a very important role in the Ottoman Empire, but it didn't emerge in any great fashion until the Greek Orthodox, the Greeks, started to withdraw from Anatolia to become part of the Kingdom of Greece after 1830. Now, once that happened, the Ottomans basically filled in all of the positions that the Greek Orthodox had held. And so throughout the 19th century, you found the Armenians, because of their knowledge of foreign languages, rose up to be particularly high in ministries of finance, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Education, Justice. I mean, really, name them. All of the important ministries. Obviously, they weren't very much involved in the military, but they ran the place. At the same time, the Armenian nationalism, all of the other sort of minorities had their nationalist movements a little bit earlier, but the Armenian nationalism was very slow to flower. And one of the reasons behind that was that the Armenian patriarch was very against it. He was quite happy with the powers that accrued to him and to the religious hierarchy, and there wasn't a great deal of support. So it really wasn't until there was significant unrest and disturbance in the areas that the Armenians were found in, and this was really due to the fact that so many Muslims fleeing from the Circassian, from the Caucasus, were coming into these areas. So you were having huge numbers of Muslim refugees coming in as refugees in areas that were maybe 50% Christian Armenian, 50% Muslim Kurds. And at a certain point, after a number of the Armenian militias actually fought with the Russian army, we have the development of the really profound Armenian tragedy and genocide that followed. I don't want to go into the details of that, but what we do know is that in a very short period of time, just a couple of years, between 1.5 to 2 million Armenians were forced from their homes in eastern Anatolia and sent on the death marches that we all know about along the Euphrates River towards Deir ez-Zor and Mosul. And of this 1.5 to 2 million, there are a number of different estimates, but I think we can safely say that at least 750,000, if not 1 million, died. And the other 750,000 then dispersed into Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Egypt today. Again, with the Armenians, many of them did find onward asylum, particularly in France and in Canada and in the United States. A very large Armenian community in Napa Valley in California. And Woodrow Wilson, in particular, was very sympathetic to the Armenians and initially thought very carefully about whether to take the Armenians under his wing, but a lot of that negotiation failed at the time that the League of Nations was established. Now, this is a very long quote. I'm not going to read it all to you. I wouldn't even presume to keep your attention that long, but I just want to point out some of the really prominent features of this narrative because it was so typical of the Armenian narrative. An orphan in the closing years of the Ottoman Empire, tale of death of his father, grandfather, immense hardship, father murdered, grandmother disappeared. But it's also the story of exceptional resilience as a small child is forced to march for hundreds of miles along the Euphrates River, then being picked up and identified actually by British soldiers and taken back to Aleppo to be put into an orphanage with an Armenian church, Chatty. Allowed to stay for about 6 years, but when he turned 14, which is quite interesting since we don't think that after 14 you're no longer a child, but at the age of 14, the orphanage asked him to leave. They felt that they needed to put other children who were younger than him into the orphanage, and he was set out to find his way. So he ended up going to one city looking for relatives, not finding them, and then eventually getting a job as a porter and living off of, the discarded food from a restaurant. But eventually he found his way to Beirut. He got a job. He also then sought out somebody from his home village who he married. The two of them then insisted on maintaining their language and a lot of their cultural traditions around the church. And eventually he found his way to Damascus, where he lived with a number of other Armenian communities. And when I spoke to him, considered himself very much a Syrian and an Armenian. And unlike the Armenians who went to Lebanon, he put the Armenianness as an adjective to his being Syrian, whereas most Armenians in Lebanon do it the other way around. But again, a sad tale, but I just thought I would go over part of the really big problems about the Armenian tragedy was there was no one place that you could have called Armenia that didn't have a majority population that was something else, particularly Kurds. So this is, I've given you an idea of what was once considered Greater Armenia, extending all the way across from Azerbaijan to Cilicia. The smaller Armenia, perhaps in this area, including Mount Ararat here, was still also the homeland of the Kurds. So it was really highly unlikely, even if the nationalism had started earlier, that it would have been possible to create a homeland for a single community right in the middle of another empire, or as turned out to be, a state. So the fact that the Armenians didn't make up a majority in any place throughout this, except for perhaps the city of Van or Bitlis, also worked very much against the possibility of the Armenians having emerged out of the negotiations at the end of World War I with a state of its own. I just put this particular slide in, although it's from the 1930s, which is the second wave of Armenians fleeing from the area of Cilicia, which the French had negotiated with Turkey to give back to Turkey. And many Armenians who were in Cilicia decided they didn't want to be in Turkish rule. And so this group then came down, and many of them settled in the area of Anjar, which also is an important archaeological site for the early Umayyad period. I put it in now because, of course, this area now has about 600,000 refugees from Syria being hosted by Armenian and other Christian villagers, as well as a host of stateless Bedouin from the area of the Bekaa, people who had refused to register with the French during the early period of the French Mandate. So it's this region now that has the majority of refugees from Syria who fled into Lebanon, living in informal encampments. The fourth community I wanted to talk about, you probably know most of these details. I'll just go over a few of them. But as some of you know, Palestine was an integral part of the Ottoman Empire. It was an integral part of Bilad al-Sham. It was really, some people called it southern Syria. And between 1917 and 1947, the Arabs of Palestine fought very strongly against the number of secret agreements that undermined the League of Nations mandate to give the Arab Palestine full independence. So we had first the Hussein McMahon correspondence, which came about after the defeat of the British at Gallipoli. As you know, there was such fear that they were going to be defeated by the Ottomans that they sent their agents to negotiate with Emir Hussein of the Hijaz to try and persuade him to fight against the Ottomans. And if he did, then they would recognize an Arab kingdom, Arab state. There's a lot of discussion. I think we still need to see a revisionist history about the Hussein McMahon correspondence, because although that was taking place in 1915, 1916, the documents didn't actually emerge until 1938, 39 about that agreement. At the same time, you have the infamous Sykes-Picot, which drew up the areas of influence and created the mandates, the British mandate of Iraq and Transjordan, and the Syrian mandate managed by France in Syria and Lebanon. And on top of all this, you had in 1917 the Balfour Declaration, which was really the result of decades of work by very wealthy European Jews to recognize the right of European Jews to have a home in Palestine. All these secret agreements integrated into the League of Nations, which was created as a result of a lot of the lobbying of the supporters of Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points, which was to create this League of Nations and also to really follow through on the principle of self-determination. Unfortunately, the self-determination was for European communities. It wasn't really recognized for the Arab region. So by 1947, the British gave up its League of Nations mandate on Palestine and handed Palestine back to the United Nations, which incidentally was quite different from what they did in Iraq. They recognized they couldn't control Iraq, and in 1932, they didn't hand back the mandate of Iraq to the United Nations. They allowed Iraq to become an independent kingdom. But between 1947 and 1948, over a very short period of time, as you know, nearly 750,000 people in Palestine were forced from their homes and pushed out of that part of Palestine, moving into what we now know of as Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. Fortunately, we have the work, certainly since the late 1980s, of a number of revisionist Israeli historians who've been able to show how much this was an ethnic cleansing, how much this was a plan. It was called Plan Dalet, to move these populations out so as to be able to create a majority Jewish population in these regions. So I just go over for a minute the Peel Commission, the partition plan. A lot of people think of the partition plan on Palestine as having emerged in 1947, but its roots go back to 1937, when the Arab uprising that had taken place which started in 1936 but continued for quite a long time, the British sent a commission out to try and understand the reasons for the uprising and to propose a solution. And everybody thought that now the British were going to propose a greater balance in the way that the Arab Palestinians were being treated in relation to the Ashkenazi European Jews who were settling in Palestine. But lo and behold, the Peel Commission, instead of that, simply went back and re-endorsed the Balfour Declaration and proposed splitting Palestine into a Jewish state, an Arab state, and an international corridor around Jerusalem. This was picked up again in 1948, then by the General Assembly of the United Nations in General Assembly Resolution 181, which I've heard Netanyahu refer to quite often as being the resolution which endorses and gives Israel the right to exist, if I can put it that way under brackets. But I just wanted to repeat that Resolution 181 actually stated very, very clearly that there were to be two states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, in economic union, and the Jewish state was to be 60% Jewish and 40% Arab, and the Arab state was to be 80% Arab and 20% Jewish, because this was the way the population was dispersed. And until the two states came into effect, there was not meant to be the recognition of either state. So 181, well, you could almost say maybe now Palestinians should go back to 181, but the result was, as I said a little bit earlier, the massive flight of Palestinians, but again, always with the idea that they were going to return home once the fighting was over. Many took their house keys with them, their land deeds and so on, thinking they might have to prove that the houses and so on belonged to them. But more than 65 years later, we don't really have a resolution to that. I put this slide in now because it's particularly poignant. This is what is referred to as the Yarmouk camp in Syria. It's not an official UN camp. It's really a suburb of Damascus. You couldn't really define when you were entering the camp, when you weren't. It's a poorer neighborhood of Damascus, but this picture was taken in 2010. It doesn't look like that anymore. It did house around 200,000 Palestinians in 2010. It now has only about 18,000. Most of the other Palestinians have dispersed. Only 80,000 have crossed the border, many of them, of course, recognizing if they cross the border, they're not going to be able to go back, which is going to create even a more dangerous situation for them if the Assad government doesn't fall. So I just thought I would add, again, the complexity about whether you flee, whether you stay, and under what conditions you accept to live. So the fourth group that I just wanted to say a little bit more about, and I'll be try and be brief, were the Kurds. The Kurds are a very important, I'm going to say ethnic group or tribal group or feudal group, depending on how you want to look at them in terms of history. But I think the important thing is to say that in the 19th century, they were an immensely important source of manpower for all of the Ottoman campaigns against the Russians. And the tribal system amongst the Kurds was such that the feudal leaders would raise the troops that were needed, and generally they were expecting some kind of payback. But as you got closer to the end of the 19th century, with less and less payback and more demands for manpower, more and more of the Kurdish feudal lords began to rise up against the Ottomans. However, up until really the early part of the 20th century, most of the Kurds regarded themselves as part of the main Sunni millet. They didn't really think about themselves as being outsiders or a different ethno-religious group. They were thinking in terms of basically most of them being Sunni Muslims and therefore part of the main group. So the Kurdish nationalism is very, very recent. It really only started emerging, I would say, around the mid-1920s. In 1923, Mustafa Kemal, having refused the terms of the original Treaty of Sèvres at the end of World War I, and began his fight to keep the Greeks out of Anatolia. In 1923, he succeeded to push the Greeks out of Anatolia and to create a rump state, which was the modern Turkish state. He was faced with real problems of what to do with Mosul, an important Kurdish and Arab province. He agreed to allow the League of Nations to decide what would be, who would have the province of Mosul. And because the British had not respected the original armistice to end the fighting between the Ottomans and the British, this is the Armistice of Mudros, on October 30th, 1918, but had continued fighting in order to grab Mosul after the armistice. Many historians suggest that he thought the League of Nations would recognize that that was inappropriate behavior of a civilized nation and award him Mosul. But that didn't happen, and in the end, he decided to just let Mosul go to Iraq, the British-mandated Iraq, in order to at least have his rump state in Turkey. But let me just show you again. This is the outline of what you would call Kurdistan. I've pulled it a little bit in order to get it to fit onto the image, so it's a distorted map, so to speak. But it gives you a sense of the spread of the Kurds across the four modern nation states that emerged at the end of World War I. So today you've got 25 million Kurds spread around, there are about 13 million in Turkey, about 4 million in Iraq, another 5-6 million in Iran, and about 2.5 million in Syria, but spread across the four national borders created at the end of World War I. This again was the special cavalry that was set up by the Ottomans, the Kurdish cavalry. It's a photograph probably taken somewhere near Van, near the Armenian border. And of course, this particular cavalry was very much implicated in the Armenian massacres as Kurds and Circassians and other Muslims moved into these areas. It wasn't really surprising that this Kurdish cavalry became quite enraged and turned a lot of its negative attention to the Armenians. So let me just begin with a bit of a summing up. So what I really wanted to get across was this idea of the whole region of the Levant as a region that was the first place of exile for large numbers of communities from outside the region, for communities that often longed to return to their homelands, but recognized that there was no onward migration possible for them, nor was there really any kind of return, except for, as I mentioned earlier, the largely Christian refugees or those who were highly skilled. And what emerged from the end of the 19th century throughout the 20th century was a transformation of these former confessional communities, former millet communities that learned how to live side by side, a kind of proto-cosmopolitanism that developed largely because of the freedom of movement that had been permitted in the Ottoman period and that was largely allowed to function throughout the 20th century. With, again, the kind of remnants of that semi-autonomous rule that existed within the specific ethno-religious or confessional communities. So there was a kind of cosmopolitanism which emerged in the 20th century that was not tied to a particular physical place so much as it was to the social community that was linked often across many of these modern nations of the Levant. And alongside of it was the way in which these communities often lived side by side, but there was a great deal of sharing and acceptance of others. So they weren't ghettos as much as they were units, which a number of anthropologists have called nodes of cosmopolitanism or local cosmopolitanism. Those who are quite shy to use that word, we'll call it nodes of local celebration and sharing of diversity. So for the most part, this kind of residual trait of tolerance you still found within the region. And over time, many of these forced migrants then became important minorities within the state. So as I was saying earlier, in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, you found that the Circassians became important minorities, the Druze in Lebanon and Syria, important minorities, the Armenians. The Kurds are a special case. The Kurds originally, who had been in the region for at least 600-700 years, were granted citizenship and kept their citizenship. It was only those who fled into the various countries after the takeover, the creation of the modern Turkish state, the secular state, who ended up becoming denationalized in the 1960s, in 1960 Syria, and then stateless. So what am I trying to tell you about? I'm trying to tell you about these historic stories of exile, but the ways in which homelands were remembered, but remembered through narratives, the ways in which various minority groups lived in close contact with each other, and this kind of these host community relations being still alive today.